A fiery inferno, a lone man trapped in the wilderness, and a race against time. Daniel Walker's ordinary hike turned into a harrowing battle for survival, surrounded by flames and driven by the will to see his family again. What he endured will leave you breathless. The Sierra Nevada foothills shimmered under the relentless midday sun. Dry grass whispered in the faint breeze, brittle leaves clinging to gnarled oaks. It was summer, the season of endless blue skies and the lurking threat of wildfires. For Daniel Walker, this was sanctuary. Little did he know his face would grace the front page of the Golden Ridge Chronicle by morning, emerging from the ashes of a nightmare. Dan adjusted his backpack, its weight familiar and grounding. Below him, the valley stretched wide, dotted with golden grass and rugged peaks. At 53, Dan was a contractor with a full life. A loving wife, Laura, his rock of nearly 30 years, and their teenage daughter, Grace, whose laughter brightened even the hardest days. Yet, solitude called to him, and these solo hikes were his way of reconnecting with nature and himself. That morning had started like any other. Leaving a note for Laura, he'd set off early, savoring the cool, crisp air. The trail was remote, winding through forests and meadows. On his way, he'd passed a man, unkempt, hurried, and avoiding eye contact. The encounter left a vague unease, but Dan shook it off, eager to embrace the trail's silence. The path stretched before him, a ribbon winding through ridges and valleys. The golden grass rippled in the wind, and distant peaks stood like sentinels. Inspired, Dan paused on a flat rock, pulling out his sketchbook, the one he never ventured into the wild without. His pencil captured a lone oak tree on a hill, its twisted branches defiant against the harsh landscape. Time slipped by until the shifting sun reminded him to move on. As he walked, a subtle shift in the air caught his attention. The light turned amber, and the sun's glow softened, edges blurred. Then came the smell. Smoke. Dan's pace slowed, unease creeping in. He scanned the horizon. The valley looked serene, but the scent of burning wood was unmistakable. A wildfire. Turning back toward his truck seemed logical. But as he climbed toward the ridge, thick smoke blocked the path. Flames flickered in the distance, leaping toward dry grass and trees. The fire had moved faster than he anticipated, driven by gusting winds. His way out was gone. Panic threatened, but Dan forced himself to think. The valley's dense vegetation was a tinderbox, and the mountains formed a natural trap. He needed a plan. A stronger wave of smoke hit him, and he coughed, covering his nose and mouth. The fire was closer than he'd thought. He had to move. Dan started down the trail into the valley, boots crunching over dry ground. The sky darkened with smoke, and the crackling of flames grew louder. Fear clawed at him, but he focused on each step, each breath. One step at a time, he muttered. Rounding a rocky outcrop, he spotted it. A dark opening in the rock face further down the trail. A cave. Relief surged. Caves had sheltered shepherds and hikers in this area for decades. If he could reach it, he'd have a chance. But the trail ahead was steep and rocky, and the fire was closing in. Dan tightened his grip on his pack and began his descent. The race against the flames had begun. The cave was just ahead, a shadowy hollow in the hillside, but the path to it was treacherous. Loose rocks and uneven terrain lay between Dan and safety. Behind him, the fire roared louder, its smoke choking the air. Ash swirled on the wind, stinging his eyes and burning his throat. Just a little further, he muttered, clutching the straps of his pack. He picked his way down a rocky slope, testing each step. Halfway down, his boots slipped on loose gravel and he fell hard. His ankle twisted sharply, pain shooting through his leg as he tumbled to the ground. He groaned, forcing himself upright. The ankle wasn't broken, but it would slow him down. The fire's heat pressed closer, fueling his urgency. Limping, he reached the cave, collapsing just inside. The air was cooler here, the rock walls damp beneath his hands. A small stream trickled along one side, its sound soothing despite the chaos outside. Dan gulped water from his bottle, splashing some on his face to wash away the grime and sweat. For now, he was safe, but the fire's relentless crackle reminded him that safety was fleeting. Deeper inside, a faint breeze hinted at ventilation. Dan felt a flicker of hope. He wouldn't suffocate here, but his swollen ankle and the fire's unpredictability weighed on him. He pulled out his phone, its signal dead but battery intact. The photos on it gave him strength. Grace's laughter on her birthday, Laura's warm smile on a Sunday morning. "I'll get back to you," he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. The hours dragged on as he listened to the fire's advance, its glow painting the sky outside a hellish orange. Dan paced the cave to keep his body moving, each step a reminder of his injury. He tore a strip from his shirt, wrapping it around his ankle for support. Outside, ash fell like snow, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning. As night fell, the roar of the fire softened. The quiet unnerved him. Fires could shift unpredictably, reigniting without warning. Exhausted, Dan leaned against the cave wall, clutching his phone like a lifeline. His thoughts drifted to Laura and Grace, imagining Laura pacing the house, phone in hand, and Grace sitting on the porch, waiting for him. "I'll make it back," he promised, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. The distant howl of a coyote broke the silence, a mournful sound that mirrored his loneliness. Dan closed his eyes, letting the trickle of the stream lull him into a restless sleep. Tomorrow, he would face the fire again. But for now, he had survived. The morning after the fire was eerily silent, the world reduced to ash and charred remnants. Dan emerged from the cave, his body aching and his ankle still throbbing. The sun rose weakly through the smoky haze, casting an amber light over the scorched valley. Every step was a reminder of the long road ahead, his walking stick a necessary crutch against the uneven terrain. The stream was his guide. It cut a path through the valley, its water shallow but steady. Dan knew it would eventually lead him to safety, but the journey would be grueling. He limped forward, scanning the desolate landscape for signs of danger or a potential way out. The once familiar trail was unrecognizable, swallowed by blackened earth and skeletal trees. Hours passed as he followed the stream, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the soot that clung stubborn to his skin. The heat was relentless, the air still heavy with the remnants of smoke. He paused often, leaning on his makeshift cane, his breaths shallow and labored. Midday brought a small reprieve. Dan found shade beneath the charred remains of a tree, its branches skeletal and fragile. He eased himself down, pulling out his water bottle and taking measured sips. His stomach growled, but his pack had little more than a few granola bars, and he needed to ration what remained. As he rested, he thought of Laura and Grace. Their faces flashed vividly in his mind. Laura's worried eyes, Grace's determined smile. They were his anchor, the reason he had to keep moving. "Just a little further," he muttered, pushing himself back to his feet. The stream began to wind through narrower passages, the rocky terrain forcing Dan to navigate carefully. His ankle protested with every step, but he pressed on, his grip on the walking stick tightening. As the afternoon stretched on, the valley slowly gave way to gentler slopes, the promise of open ground spurring him forward. Then, in the distance, he saw movement. two blurry figures. He stopped, his heart racing, unsure if they were real or a trick of his exhausted mind. He waved his arm weakly, hoping to catch their attention. The figures grew clearer as they approached. A man and a woman, both dressed in rugged outdoor gear, carried tools and backpacks. Relief flooded through Dan as the man raised a hand in greeting. "Hey there," the man called out, his voice steady and reassuring. "You okay?" Dan nodded, though he felt far from it. "I've been better," he said hoarsely, his voice rough from the smoke and dehydration. The woman, younger and with a kind face, hurried forward to support him. "Let's get you out of here," she said softly, her tone comforting. With their help, Dan began the final stretch of his journey out of the valley. Each step was a painful reminder of his ordeal, but the weight of isolation lifted as he leaned on their strength. He didn't ask their names or how they had found him. He was simply grateful they had. As the three of them reached the outskirts of the wilderness, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the blackened ground. Golden Ridge was in sight, the faint outlines of buildings bathed in the soft hues of twilight. For the first time in days, Dan allowed himself to be might truly make it home. "I promised," he whispered to himself, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. "I promised I'd get back." The two strangers walked beside him, steady and silent, as if they understood the weight of that promise. Together they moved forward, the valley and its horrors fading behind them. Golden Ridge came into view as Dan limped out of the foothills, his makeshift walking stick thudding softly against the dirt. The soft twilight bathed the small town in hues of gold and purple, the buildings standing resilient against the backdrop of the charred horizon. Smoke lingered faintly in the air, a grim reminder of the fire's wrath. But here, there was life. People moving about, rebuilding, and comforting one another. Dan's heart raced as he crossed into town, each step bringing him closer to the home he had feared he might never see again. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with soot, but he moved forward, ignoring the pain in his swollen ankle. A few townsfolk paused to watch him, their expressions a mix of recognition and relief. "Dan Walker?" someone called, their voice tinged with disbelief. He nodded faintly, too weary to respond properly. A man ran off toward the community center, no doubt to spread the word. Golden Ridge's small, bustling square was alive with activity. Neighbors carried lumber, cleared debris, and shared supplies. A few children ran by, their laughter a bright contrast to the heavy air. Dan felt a lump rise in his throat as he spotted the familiar sign of the community center ahead, a place that had always been the heart of their little town. And then he saw her. Grace was the first to appear, her figure framed by the open door of the community center. The young woman's wide eyes filled with tears the moment she spotted him. She broke into a run, her arms outstretched, her cries of joy piercing the evening air. Dan dropped his walking stick and opened his arms, catching her as she collided into him. "Dad," she sobbed, clutching him tightly. "You are home. I was so scared. I thought—" "I am here, Grace," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I am here." Before he could say more, Laura emerged from the building. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then she hurried toward him, her steps quick and unsteady, her hands trembling. Dan barely had time to brace himself before Laura flung her arms around his neck, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," she choked out, her tears soaking into his shirt. "You didn't," he murmured, holding her as tightly as his aching body allowed. "I promised I'd come back." The three of them stood there, tangled in a desperate, tearful embrace, as the golden light faded into the deep blues of night. Around them, townsfolk stopped to watch, some wiping their own eyes at the sight of the family reunited. Later, as they sat together on the porch of their home, the faint smell of tea wafting from the mugs Laura had prepared, Dan flipped through the pages of his sketchbook. The drawings, smudged and incomplete, were a testament to the journey he had endured. Grace leaned over his shoulder, pointing at a half-finished sketch of the Sierra Nevada foothills. "You'll finish it, right, Dad?" she asked softly. "Of course," he said, smiling. "That's the plan." Laura reached over, placing her hand over his. "We're just glad you are here to do it," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. Dan gazed at the horizon where the stars began to emerge, a peaceful quiet settling over Golden Ridge. The fire had scarred the land and shaken their community, but it hadn't broken them. "In the depth of winter," Dan murmured, his voice carrying the weight of his journey, "I finally learned that there was in me an invincible summer." Laura and Grace exchanged a glance, their smiles warm and filled with hope. Together, they sat in the stillness, the promise of brighter days ahead, etched into the night. Weeks passed, and Golden Ridge began to heal. Homes were rebuilt, and the charred earth showed the first signs of life returning. At the community center, Dan sat at a table covered in sketches, each page capturing moments from his harrowing journey and the quiet resilience of their town. Grace leaned over his shoulder, admiring the sketches. "You are telling the story," she said, her voice proud. Dan nodded. "It's not just my story. It's ours, the town's, the land's." Laura entered, carrying a tray with 3 steaming mugs of tea. Setting them down, she placed a hand on Dan's shoulder, her touch grounding him. "We'll endure," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the same strength he had seen in her the night they reunited. Together, they stepped outside to the porch. The foothills glowed under the setting sun, and the air carried the faint scent of pine. Dan looked at Laura and Grace, his family, his anchor, and smiled. In the end, he thought, hope is what endures. Dan Walker's journey was a testament to this truth. Even when surrounded by the ashes of destruction, the human spirit has the strength to rise, endure, and inspire.